January 1898. Last Chance, Utah Territory. Sarah Sullivan stood in the doorway of her timber cabin, watching the circuit judge's wagon roll down the frozen main street, and she knew with cold certainty that everything she'd built in 3 years was about to collapse. The hard winter had left stores bare across the mining camp, tempers short, and debts stacking like cordwood. Judge Ambrose Caldwell made his rounds every 6 weeks, selling verdicts to the highest bidder, and this morning he'd nailed a foreclosure notice to her door. She pulled her cream wool shawl tighter against the knife-edge wind, her breath clouding white in the thin January air. The notice claimed she owed the Miners Trust $217 in back interest on a loan she'd never signed. Her honey blonde braid whipped across her shoulder as she turned back inside, slamming the plank door hard enough to rattle the window glass. The small silver locket around her neck felt suddenly heavy, the weight of a promise she hadn't meant to make. Inside that locket was a photograph that shouldn't exist, a tintype of her standing beside a man she'd never met until 2 weeks ago. Martin Sullivan, railroad surveyor, reckless and brave in ways that made her pulse jump and her practical Swedish sense scream warnings. He'd appeared in Last Chance with transit and measuring chains, tasked with plotting a spur line through the canyon to connect the mining camp to the main Denver and Rio Grande tracks. But the railroad had sent him with a second mission, one he'd shared with her in a whispered conversation behind the assay office. Keep peace between the feuding claim holders, prevent violence that would scare off Eastern investors, and quietly investigate why so many properties kept changing hands through the circuit court. She'd told him about the forged loan papers the same night he'd pressed the locket into her palm, his steel gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that stole her breath.
"You're going to need proof that photograph ties us together in a way Caldwell can't ignore," he'd said, his voice low and urgent.
She hadn't understood then. Now, reading the foreclosure notice with its official stamps and perfectly forged signatures, she understood that Martin had seen this coming. The locket was insurance, evidence, a promise neither of them had expected to need so soon. She paced the length of her cabin, past the cast-iron stove radiating precious heat, past the narrow cot with its patchwork quilt, past the shelf holding 3 books and a chipped teacup. Through the window, she could see the judge's wagon stopped outside the Miners Trust. Ambrose Caldwell climbing down with the careful movements of a man who wore expensive suits under his traveling cloak. Patient like a spider, Martin had called him, and the description fit. Caldwell never rushed, never showed his hand, just spun his web of fraudulent documents and waited for desperate people to stumble in. The bank auction was set for Friday, 3 days away, and Sarah had exactly $14 to her name. Outside, boots crunched through frozen snow. She recognized the stride before the knock came, quick and purposeful.
"Sarah, it's Martin. Let me in."
She unlatched the door, and he pushed inside, bringing a blast of cold air and the smell of pine smoke from the town's morning fires. Snow dusted his dark charcoal coat and clung to his wavy brown hair.
"I saw the notice," he said, shaking snow from his shoulders. He posted 6 more this morning, all properties adjacent to the proposed rail corridor.
"He's clearing the land for the railroad," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Taking it for himself before the surveys even finalize."
"Not just for himself," Martin corrected, pulling a folded map from his leather satchel and spreading it across her small table. "Look at the pattern. Every foreclosure clusters around potential station sites, water access, or timber resources. Caldwell's working with someone who has advanced knowledge of the route."
"The banker," Sarah said immediately. Whoever's feeding him information from the Miners' Trust.
Thomas Pruitt, Martin confirmed, tapping a location on the map. He's been branch manager here for 2 years, just long enough to build trust and start calling in strategic loans. But here's what they don't know.
He reached into his coat and pulled out a second document, this one bearing the official seal of the Railroad Commission.
I'm authorized to halt any land transfers within the corridor if fraud is suspected, he said. But I need proof that holds up in front of witnesses, not just Caldwell's word against ours.
The loan documents, Sarah said, moving to the stove where she'd tucked the foreclosure notice for safekeeping. If we can prove these signatures are forged...
We need the originals from the bank vault, Martin interrupted. The ones Caldwell filed with Pruitt. If we can get them before Friday.
The plan was insane, and they both knew it. The Miners' Trust kept its vault locked, except during business hours, and Thomas Pruitt never left the building unattended. But Sarah had been inside that vault once, 3 months ago, when she deposited the deed to her cabin for safekeeping during a particularly rough stretch of claim-jumping incidents. She knew the layout, knew the shelves where documents were filed, knew the combination, because she'd watched Pruitt's hands through the reflection in his brass desk lamp.
I can get us in, she said quietly. But we'll need a distraction, something big enough to pull Pruitt out of the bank for at least 10 minutes.
Martin's mouth curved into a grin that was equal parts dangerous and delighted.
Leave that to me, he said. How do you feel about causing a small railway emergency? They worked through the afternoon, refining details until the plan felt less like suicide and more like calculated risk. Martin would stage a surveying accident near the rail depot, something involving broken equipment, and an urgent telegram that needed Pruitt's signature as the town's acting postmaster. Sarah would slip into the bank through the back entrance, the one that opened onto the alley where deliveries arrived. She'd have 8 minutes, maybe 10 if Martin could stretch the emergency. The sun was setting, painting the canyon walls with streaks of amber and rust, when a knock interrupted their planning. Sarah tensed, hand moving instinctively toward the iron poker by the stove, but Martin was already at the door. He opened it to reveal a small figure bundled in 2 large coats, a child of maybe 8 years, with wind-chapped cheeks and frightened eyes.
The boy delivered his message in a rush, words tumbling over each other. His mother was sick, needed the Swedish woman who knew healing herbs, needed her now before the fever took hold. Sarah recognized the family. Miners who lived in a dugout on the north edge of camp. People who'd shared their last sack of cornmeal with her when her own stores ran low in December. She grabbed her medicine bag without hesitation, stuffing it with willow bark and dried yarrow, a precious vial of carbolic acid for cleaning wounds.
I have to go, she told Martin. Mrs. Chen could die without treatment.
Then I'm coming with you, he said firmly. That dugout is 2 miles into disputed territory, and the Harrigan brothers have been running wild since the judge ruled their claim valid last month.
They bundled into their coats and followed the boy into the gathering dusk. The temperature was dropping fast, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made exposed skin burn. Sarah clutched her medicine bag in the boy's hand, letting Martin break trail through knee-deep drifts. The path wound along the base of the canyon, past abandoned mine shafts and claim markers barely visible under snow. Halfway to the dugout, they heard horses. Martin pulled Sarah and the boy behind a granite outcrop just as 3 riders appeared through the trees, moving slow and purposeful. The Harrigan brothers, all 3 of them, plus 2 hired guns Sarah didn't recognize. They were heading toward the Chen dugout, and they were carrying torches.
"They're going to burn them out," Martin said, his voice flat with controlled fury. Caldwell must have sold the Chen's claim to the Harrigans, promised them clear title if they handled the eviction themselves.
We can't let them, Sarah said, already moving.
"Sarah, wait." Martin grabbed her arm, pulling her back. 5 armed men against the 2 of us. That's not bravery. It's suicide.
Then what do you suggest? She demanded, her accent sharpening with stress the way it always did when emotions ran high. We hide and let them kill a family.
Martin's jaw worked, his mind clearly racing through options and discarding them just as fast. Then, his expression changed, shifted into something reckless and brilliant.
"We don't hide," he said. "We make them think the railroad's already claimed this entire section. Official surveyors on site, federal protection, the whole show."
He pulled surveying stakes from his pack, the ones marked with the Denver and Rio Grande insignia, and started hammering them into the frozen ground in a wide perimeter around the dugout. Sarah understood immediately, grabbed stakes from his hands, and moved to place them at intervals, creating the illusion of an active survey in progress. The boy ran ahead to warn his family, and Sarah prayed they'd have the sense to stay inside and quiet. The Harrigan brothers rode into the clearing, just as Martin planted the final stake directly in front of the dugout entrance. He stood there in the torchlight, surveying transit on his shoulder, looking every inch the federal authority he technically was. The lead Harrigan reined in his horse hard enough to make it rear. The man shouted that this was private property, legally purchased, and they had every right to evict squatters. Martin didn't flinch.
"This section is under federal survey for railroad right-of-way," he said, his voice carrying clear across the frozen ground. "Any interference with survey operations is a federal offense. I suggest you take your dispute to the land office in Salt Lake City."
The hired guns exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not paid enough to tangle with federal authority. But the Harrigans weren't backing down so easily. The middle brother, the one with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, spurred his horse forward a few steps. The man accused Martin of bluffing, said everyone knew the rail route wasn't finalized, said Judge Caldwell himself had assured them this claim was clean. Sarah stood slowly, letting her medicine bag fall open to reveal the herbs and carbolic acid, making herself visible in the torchlight.
The Chen family is under my care, she said, pitching her voice to Carrie. Mrs. Chen has fever, possibly pneumonia. If you force them out into this cold, you'll be killing a woman and 4 children. The Railroad Commission will want to know why federal surveyors stood by and watched murder.
It was a bluff. A complete bluff. But Sarah delivered it with the cold certainty of someone who'd spent 3 winters surviving on grit and nerve. The hired guns were already turning their horses, muttering about not signing up for this kind of trouble. The Harrigans held their ground another long moment, torches guttering in the wind, before the scarred brother spat into the snow and jerked his horse around. They rode back the way they'd come, and Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief. Martin caught her elbow, steadying her.
"That was the gutsiest thing I've ever seen," he said quietly.
That was the stupidest thing I've ever done, Sarah corrected, but she was smiling despite herself.
They delivered the medicine to Mrs. Chen, who was indeed burning with fever, but responded quickly to willow bark tea and cool compresses. The boy's father, a quiet man with coal dust permanently embedded in his knuckles, gripped Sarah's hand with wordless gratitude. By the time they started back toward town, full dark had fallen, and the temperature had dropped to brutal levels. Martin insisted on walking Sarah all the way to her cabin, despite the fact that his own lodgings were on the opposite end of camp. They moved through pools of yellow lamplight spilling from windows, past the saloon where piano music fought against the wind, past the assay office and the claims recorder, and the Miners' Trust with its locked vault and its secrets. At Sarah's door, Martin hesitated.
About tomorrow, he started. The bank job. If anything goes wrong,
Nothing will go wrong, Sarah said firmly, though her stomach was already nodding at the thought.
if it does, Martin continued, if Caldwell or Pruitt catch you, I need you to show them the locket. Tell them we're married, that the property is jointly held. It won't stop the foreclosure, but it'll buy time for me to get federal marshals involved.
We're not married, Sarah pointed out, though her fingers moved instinctively to the locket at her throat.
The photograph says we are, Martin said. Or it will, to anyone who doesn't look too close. That tintype was taken 6 months ago in Denver, before I even knew Last Chance existed. The woman in it is my cousin's wife, but she could be your twin. The man is me. If we claim it's our wedding portrait, Caldwell won't be able to prove otherwise.
Sarah opened the locket, studying the image in the faint moonlight. The woman did look startlingly like her. Same blonde hair, same high cheekbones, same slender build. And the man was unmistakably Martin, though his hair was shorter and his expression more carefree than she'd ever seen it.
This is insane, she whispered.
This whole situation is insane, Martin agreed. But it's the best insurance I can give you.
He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the freezing air. Close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in his pale eyes.
I won't let him take your home, he said. I promise you that.
Sarah believed him, which was perhaps the most insane part of all. She'd known this man for 2 weeks, barely long enough to trust him with her life. Yet here she was, planning to break into a bank with him and potentially claim him as her husband. She touched the locket, feeling the weight of that impossible promise.
Tomorrow then, she said. We get the documents, we expose Caldwell, and we save my cabin.
Tomorrow, Martin agreed.
He left, his footsteps crunching away into the darkness, and Sarah went inside to a cabin that suddenly felt both smaller and lonelier than it ever had before. She stoked the fire, made weak tea from her dwindling supply, and tried to sleep. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bank vault, saw Caldwell's patient spider smile, saw herself trapped in a web of forged papers with no way out. When dawn came, gray and bitter cold, she was already dressed and waiting. Martin arrived just after sunup, bringing fresh bread he'd somehow acquired from the boarding house kitchen, and a revised plan that made Sarah's pulse jump with equal parts fear and determination.
Pruitt opens the bank at 8, Martin said, spreading the bread with precious butter. At 8:15, I'm going to ride hard into town claiming there's been a survey stake dispute at the North Pass, possible violence. Need the acting postmaster to witness and notarize an incident report immediately.
And if he doesn't take the bait? Sarah asked.
He will, Martin said with confidence. Pruitt's terrified of anything that might disrupt railroad negotiations. He'll come running.
They synchronized their pocket watches, a small intimacy that felt weighted with meaning. Sarah had 7 minutes from the moment Martin's staged emergency began. 7 minutes to slip into the bank, crack the vault using the combination she'd memorized, find the loan documents, and get out. If she was caught, the best outcome was arrest. The worst was Caldwell deciding she knew too much and arranging one of his famous staged accidents. At 8 o'clock, they moved into position. Sarah waited in the alley behind the Miners' Trust, pressed against the cold brick wall, counting her heartbeats. Through the wall, she could hear the muffled sounds of Pruitt opening for business, the scrape of chairs, the clink of the cash drawer. At 8:14, Martin's voice rang out from the street, urgent and commanding, exactly as planned.
Mr. Pruitt, federal emergency. Need your signature immediately.
Footsteps hurried toward the front door. Sarah gave it a count of 10, then slipped through the back entrance, the one staff used for deliveries. The bank interior was all dark wood and brass fixtures, smelling of ledger ink and metal. The vault stood in the back corner, its heavy door currently closed, but not locked during business hours per territorial banking regulations. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the dial, but her fingers remembered the sequence. Right to 37, left to 9, right to 22, left to 41. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Inside, the vault was organized with bureaucratic precision. Metal shelves, holding stacks of documents bundled in red ribbon. Sarah scanned labels, her eyes adjusting to the dim light from the single overhead lamp. Deeds, mortgages, promissory notes, corporate charters. There. Loan documents, current foreclosures. She pulled the bundle, rifling through until she found her own name. Sarah Sullivan. Loan agreement, dated November 1897. $217 at 18% interest. The signature at the bottom was a decent forgery, but Sarah could see where the forger had hesitated on the double L in Sullivan, making the strokes slightly uneven. She stuffed the document into her dress pocket and kept searching. 6 more foreclosures, all with the same telltale hesitation in the signatures, all dated within the last 4 months. She took them all. Behind her, voices rose in the main room. Martin was stretching the emergency, demanding Pruitt come see the disputed stakes himself, insisting the situation required immediate intervention. But Pruitt was hesitating, asking questions, and Sarah's 7 minutes were rapidly evaporating. She turned to leave and froze. Standing in the vault doorway, blocking her only exit, was Judge Ambrose Caldwell. He looked at her, at the documents clutched in her hands, and his expression didn't change at all. Patient like a spider, the judge spoke softly, almost kindly, asked what she thought she was doing, suggested she put the documents back before she did something she'd regret. Sarah's mind raced. She could scream, bring Martin running, but that would expose their whole plan and likely get them both arrested. She could try to rush past Caldwell, but he was blocking the narrow doorway and she'd never make it. Or she could bluff, the way she bluffed the Harrigans, and hope her nerve held.
I'm collecting evidence of fraud, she said clearly. These loan documents bear forged signatures. I'm taking them to the federal marshal in Salt Lake City.
Caldwell's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. The judge said she was making serious accusations, said forgery was a hanging offense, asked if she had proof. Sarah opened the locket at her throat, letting him see the photograph inside.
I have proof that I'm not who these documents claim I am, she said, and I have a federal surveyor who's prepared to testify that you've been systematically clearing land for railroad development using fraudulent foreclosures.
For a long moment, Caldwell studied her face. Then, he smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. The judge said she was clever, said he respected that, then suggested they could perhaps reach an arrangement. He could make the foreclosure disappear, could even provide her with a legitimate loan at favorable terms if she'd simply return the documents and forget what she'd seen. It was the same offer he'd probably made to a dozen desperate people, a spider's web disguised as salvation. Sarah thought of Mrs. Chen burning with fever, of the boy with wind-chapped cheeks, of every person in Last Chance who'd been crushed under Caldwell's patient, methodical corruption.
No arrangement, she said.
Caldwell's expression hardened. He stepped into the vault, pulling the heavy door partially closed behind him, trapping them both in the confined space. The judge said she was making a fatal mistake. Said accidents happened all the time in mining camps. Said a woman alone was particularly vulnerable. It was a threat delivered with the same calm patience he used for everything, and Sarah felt ice slide down her spine. But before Caldwell could move, the vault door slammed fully open, rebounding off the wall with a metallic clang. Martin stood in the doorway, and his steel-gray eyes were absolutely furious.
"Step away from her," he said, his voice deadly quiet.
Caldwell turned, and for the first time Sarah saw genuine surprise cross his face. He recovered quickly, shifting into the role of affronted authority. The judge demanded to know who Martin thought he was, interfering with official court business, threatened him with contempt charges. Martin pulled a document from his coat, the one bearing the Railroad Commission seal.
"Martin Sullivan, federal surveyor with arrest authority for fraud affecting interstate commerce," he said. "And you're under investigation for systematic land theft through forged documents."
Pruitt appeared behind Martin, his face pale and confused, clearly just now understanding that his emergency had been a diversion. More people were gathering, drawn by raised voices, miners and shopkeepers crowding into the bank to see what the commotion was about. Sarah seized the moment, holding up the bundle of loan documents.
"These are all forgeries," she announced, pitching her voice to Carrie. "Judge Caldwell has been stealing property using fake signatures and impossible debts."
The crowd's mood shifted instantly, miners who'd lost claims beginning to shout questions and accusations. Caldwell tried to assert control, claiming the documents were perfectly legitimate, but Sarah was already passing them to the nearest witnesses, letting people see their own forged signatures. The evidence was damning and undeniable. Pruitt, seeing which way the wind was blowing, immediately began protesting that he'd had no knowledge of fraud, that he'd simply filed what the judge provided. It was a transparent attempt to save himself, but it sealed Caldwell's fate. The corrupt banker was just as guilty, but he was smart enough to turn witness against the bigger fish. Someone ran for the town marshal, though everyone knew he was in Caldwell's pocket and would be useless. But the crowd didn't need official authority. They needed justice, and they were prepared to deliver it themselves. Martin stepped between the mob and Caldwell, his surveyor's authority suddenly the only thing preventing a lynching.
"He'll stand trial," Martin said firmly. "Federal court in Salt Lake City, with federal marshals as escort. No vigilante justice, no shortcuts. We do this right."
The crowd grumbled but backed down, perhaps recognizing that a proper trial would be more satisfying than a quick rope. Caldwell, seeing his carefully constructed web collapsing, made a desperate final play. He turned to Sarah, his expression shifting into wounded innocence. The judge claimed he'd been deceived by Pruitt, that the banker had presented him with what he believed were legitimate documents, that he was merely trying to uphold the law as he understood it. His performance was masterful, his voice cracking with false emotion, his hands trembling as if wounded by the accusations. But Sarah had learned something during those desperate weeks of investigation. She'd learned that liars always underestimate the intelligence of those they've wronged. She stepped forward, pulling the locket from beneath her collar, holding it up so the photograph caught the light streaming through the bank windows.
"This photograph shouldn't exist," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through Caldwell's protestations. "It shows my mother standing outside a ranch house that wasn't built until 3 years after she died." "Your forger was careless, Judge Caldwell. He used an old tintype as reference, but placed her in front of the wrong building. My real mother never set foot on that ranch. She died in Minnesota before we ever came west."
The courtroom gasped. It was a detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, yet it unraveled everything. Caldwell's face went blank, the mask of injured innocence slipping away to reveal the cold calculation beneath. He'd been so focused on forging signatures and manipulating dates that he'd overlooked the one detail that would prove the entire inheritance claim was fabricated from the start. Martin produced the railroad survey maps next, spreading them across the banker's desk with deliberate precision. His reckless bravery had been tempered by weeks of careful planning, and now he wielded evidence like a weapon.
"These surveys show the original property boundaries," Martin explained. "They were filed with the territorial government in 1892, 6 years before your supposed debt agreements. The ranch Sarah's father built sits entirely on land that was never part of any bank collateral. Pruitt here knew that when he started calling in fake loans. He was trying to seize property he had no legal claim to."
The banker Pruitt finally broke, his composure shattering like thin ice. He pointed a shaking finger at Caldwell, his voice rising in panic as he tried to shift all blame to the judge. The two conspirators turned on each other with the viciousness of cornered animals, each trying to save himself by condemning his partner. The crowd watched in grim satisfaction as the alliance that had terrorized Last Chance collapsed into bitter recriminations. The federal marshal arrived 3 days later, riding in with 2 deputies and a wagon load of official documents from Salt Lake City. The circuit had finally caught up to Judge Ambrose Caldwell, it turned out. There were outstanding warrants in 3 territories, complaints from a dozen towns, and a pattern of corruption so extensive it had finally drawn federal attention. Sarah's courage in standing up to him had provided the final piece of evidence needed to bring formal charges. The marshal took both Caldwell and Pruitt into custody, shackling them in the back of his wagon for transport to territorial prison. As they prepared to leave, Caldwell caught Sarah's eye one final time, and she saw not remorse, but calculation. The mind of a predator already planning his next move, his next scheme. She shivered despite the warming late winter sun, grateful she'd have Martin beside her now. The days following the arrests felt strange and suspended, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the other boot to drop. But slowly, life began to return to something resembling normal. Neighbors who had feuded over the pressure of unpaid debts found common ground again. The mercantile extended credit without the crushing interest Pruitt had demanded. Food supplies that had been hoarded began to circulate freely as the artificial scarcity created by the banker's manipulations eased. But Sarah spent those days settling her father's true affairs, working with a new bank representative sent from Salt Lake City to sort through the tangled mess of legitimate and forged documents. Martin was at her side for every meeting, his surveyor's precision helping untangle property lines and validate boundaries. The young boy Tommy stayed with them, sleeping on a cot in the ranch house kitchen. His mother, too, ill to care for him properly, but improving slowly under the ministering of the town's few women skilled in healing. They worked side by side through the lengthening March days, and somewhere in the midst of all documents and property surveys, something shifted between them. The desperation that had thrown them together transformed into something deeper, something neither had expected but both recognized. Martin's reckless bravery had been gentled by Sarah's practical wisdom, while her sharp-witted caution had been warmed by his steadfast loyalty. It was Sarah who brought up the photograph first. Late one evening, as they sat reviewing paperwork by lamplight in her father's study, Tommy was asleep in the kitchen, and the March wind rattled the windows with the last gasp of winter's fury.
The locket photograph bothered me for weeks before I understood why, Sarah said softly. It wasn't just that it showed the wrong building. It was that whoever made it thought a daughter wouldn't notice. Thought I wouldn't remember my own mother's face, where she stood, what was real.
Martin reached across the desk and took her hand, his callous surveyor's fingers gentle against her work-worn palm.
You remembered everything that mattered, Martin said. You saved this entire town because you paid attention to details everyone else overlooked, including me.
You weren't overlooking anything, Sarah replied with a small smile. You were keeping peace between feuding neighbors while I was chasing paper trails. We made a good team.
We make a good team, Martin corrected, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. Present tense. If you'll have me.
Sarah felt her breath catch. They'd been building toward this moment for weeks, but hearing the words spoken aloud made her heart race. She thought of the promise the locket represented, not the false one created by forgers, but the real one. The unspoken bond that had formed between two people facing impossible odds together.
I'll have you, Sarah whispered. But I won't be a delicate wife who sits at home while you ride off to survey distant territories. I'm a homesteader, Martin. I work land. I make decisions. I won't be shut away from the life we build.
I wouldn't want you any other way, Martin said, and the sincerity in his steel-gray eyes told her he meant every word. We'll build something together. Equal partners. That's the only way I'd want it.
They married 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning when the March snow had finally melted, and the first brave crocuses pushed through the muddy ground around the church steps. It was a simple ceremony, attended by most of Last Chance, as the town turned out to celebrate the couple who had saved them all from ruin. Young Tommy stood beside them, holding the wedding rings in his small, serious hands, his mother watching from a pew with tears of gratitude streaming down her now healthier face. The preacher kept the service brief, understanding that these were practical people who'd already proven their commitment to each other in ways more binding than any ceremony. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Martin kissed Sarah with the gentle intensity of a man who'd learned that true strength lay in tenderness, while Sarah held him with the fierce determination of a woman who'd fought for every good thing in her life and would fight to keep this one. After the service, they stood together in the church doorway, greeting well-wishers and accepting congratulations. The territorial land agent approached with official documents, the deed to Sarah's ranch now properly recorded in both their names, Sullivan and Sullivan. Equal owners of the land they defended together. Sarah signed first, her signature strong and clear. Then Martin added his beside hers, their names side by side on the page, as they would be side by side in life. The town threw a celebration that afternoon. Tables set up in the muddy main street with food contributions from every household. It wasn't fancy, but it was genuine. The kind of community feast that marked important moments in hard places. Sarah stood beside her new husband, watching the people of Last Chance laugh and dance, and forget for a few hours the brutal winter they'd survived, and felt a contentment she'd never expected to know. As evening approached, and the spring sun painted the mountains gold, Martin pulled Sarah aside, walking wit, her away from the celebrating crowd toward the edge of town, where the land opened up into rolling territory that stretched toward her ranch.
"We should head home," Martin said quietly. "Our home now. Both of ours."
Our home, Sarah repeated, testing the words and finding she liked the sound of them. With Tommy staying until his mother is fully recovered, and probably a dozen neighbors dropping by with advice we don't need, and survey maps spread across every available surface, because you can't help yourself.
"And you up before dawn every day checking fence lines and planning spring planting," Martin added with a grin. "And arguing with me about property boundaries even though you know I'm right."
Especially when I know you're wrong, Sarah corrected, laughing.
They walked together through the gathering dusk. Two people who'd been forged by hardship into something stronger than either had been alone. The locket hung against Sarah's heart, no longer a symbol of false claims and forged promises, but a reminder of what they'd overcome together. Behind them, Last Chance celebrated. Ahead of them, their ranch waited. And beyond that, a future they would build with their own hands, equal partners in every sense that mattered. She held the proof that saved the entire town from a corrupt judge. Last Chance, Utah Territory, 1898. When a circuit judge and crooked banker conspired to steal homesteads with forged paperwork, Swedish settler Sarah Sullivan discovers the one piece of evidence that can stop them. A locket photograph that shouldn't exist. Teaming up with railroad surveyor Martin Sullivan, she races against time to expose a conspiracy before the entire town loses everything. A gripping Wild West romance of courage, justice, and two people who find love while fighting corruption in the unforgiving frontier. Subscribe for more authentic Western historical romances. Wild West romance, historical romance, frontier love story, 1890s romance, Utah Territory, homesteader story, railroad surveyor, corrupt judge, land fraud, Swedish immigrant, winter survival, vigilante justice, authentic Western, period romance, happy ending Western, colorized late 1800s American West photograph. Natural light, gentle contrast, slightly soft focus, subtle film grain, faint dust/scratches, slight vignetting, no text, no watermark. Beautiful Swedish woman in late 20s with honey blonde hair and practical braid, bright blue eyes, high cheekbones, slender, strong build, wearing faded cornflower blue calico dress under cream wool shawl, holding ornate silver locket high above her head, with fierce triumphant expression, tears of relief visible on her cheeks. Handsome, rugged man in early 30s with dark brown wavy hair, steel gray eyes, strong jaw with stubble, broad shoulders, wearing dark charcoal wool coat over dusty blue shirt, standing protectively beside her with one arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. His other hand gripping legal documents. Expression shows protective intensity and controlled anger. Inside Frontier Bank building, mid-morning light streaming through windows creating dramatic beams through dust. Crowd of miners and townspeople visible pressing forward behind the couple with expressions of hope and vindication. Corrupt judge in expensive dark suit, backed against vault entrance with first signs of cornered panic on his face visible in background. Foreground shows scattered forged papers fallen to wooden floor and overturned banker's chair. Midground includes brass teller cage and crowd of townspeople in period clothing. Background reveals bank's front entrance, with more people gathering outside visible through windows and snow-bright street beyond. Photorealistic cinematic style. Shot on cinema camera. Natural golden hour lighting. Shallow depth of field with soft bokeh background. Warm beige and amber color grading. Looks like a film still from a premium Western romance movie. Authentic 1800s period photography aesthetic. Professional portrait photog. RafeQuality.L/Thuthbanker. Claiming Pruitt had forged the documents without his knowledge and used his judicial seal without permission.
Lies. Martin cut him off. We have your correspondence with Pruitt, planning the whole scheme. Letters in your own hand, discussing which properties to target first, which families were vulnerable.
Sarah pulled another bundle from her coat. Letters she'd found hidden in the locket's false backing. Correspondence between Caldwell and Pruitt that detailed their conspiracy with cold precision. The judge's face went from wounded innocence to genuine fear as he realized how thoroughly his schemes had been documented. The crowd pressed closer, their anger building again, but Martin held them back with raised hands.
Federal trial, he repeated. Let him face every charge in proper court, where his corruption becomes permanent record.
2 minors volunteered to ride immediately for Salt Lake City to fetch federal marshals, refusing to trust the local law. Others offered to guard Caldwell in shifts until the marshals arrived, making it clear the judge wouldn't be leaving Last Chance alive unless it was in federal custody. Pruitt, seeing his partner caught, tried to slip toward the back door, but the crowd blocked every exit. Within an hour, both men were locked in the assay office's strong room, the only secure holding space in town, with armed guards posted outside. Sarah felt the tension drain from her body so suddenly she nearly collapsed. But Martin caught her, his strong arms steadying her, as the adrenaline faded. They stood together in the cold street outside the bank, the February sun bright on fresh snow, while townspeople clapped them on shoulders and shook their hands with gratitude. Families who'd been facing ruin now had their homes back, their futures secure. All because 2 strangers had refused to look away from injustice.
The boy, Sarah said suddenly, remembering. Tommy. We left him at the surveyor's office.
They hurried back through town, finding the child exactly where they'd left him, calmly playing with Martin's surveying tools and arranging them in careful rows. He looked up with his solemn dark eyes as they entered. Reading their expressions, Tommy asked if the bad man was caught, his voice small but hopeful. Sarah knelt beside him, taking his cold hands in hers.
He's caught, she promised. And you're safe now. Truly safe.
The boy nodded, then surprised them both by asking if they were married, since they seemed to belong together. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, while Martin cleared his throat awkwardly, but neither denied it. Something had shifted between them during the confrontation, a bond forged stronger than steel in the heat of shared danger. That evening, as the town celebrated its liberation from Caldwell's schemes, Sarah and Martin sat together in the small church at the edge of Last Chance. The building was empty except for them, the winter sunset painting the simple windows gold and amber. Martin held the locket gently, studying the impossible photograph one more time.
Your grandmother was right, he said quietly. This brought us together for a reason.
To save the town, Sarah replied, but her voice was uncertain.
Maybe, Martin agreed. Or maybe the town was just the excuse, and we were meant to find each other.
Sarah looked at him in the fading light, this reckless, brave surveyor, who'd learned gentleness through hardship, who'd stood between an angry mob and justice, because doing right mattered more than quick satisfaction. He'd risked everything to help her expose Caldwell. Trusted her instincts when he had no reason to. Defended her against men who'd called her foolish for pursuing what seemed impossible. And she'd watched him grow from a man who solved problems with fists and determination into someone who understood that real strength meant protecting the vulnerable and fighting for what was right, even when it cost him.
I was supposed to escort Tommy to his family in Nevada, she said softly. But his aunt died last month, the letter said. He has no one left.
Then he has us, Martin said simply. If you're willing.
Sarah's heart clenched at the quiet offer. At this man she barely knew offering to build a family with her. To take on a child neither of them had planned for. Simply because it was the right thing to do. She thought of her grandmother's promises, of the locket that had somehow shown her this moment before it happened, of all the impossible coincidences that had brought them to this church at sunset.
I'm willing, she whispered. If you are.
Martin smiled, that rare full smile that transformed his weathered face, and took her hand. They sat together as the sun sank below the horizon, making plans for a future neither had imagined a week ago. Martin would finish his railroad survey, then use his savings to buy land outside Last Chance, where the railroad would eventually bring prosperity. Sarah would continue her work helping immigrant families navigate the territory's complexities, using her sharp wit and practical nature to protect others from predators like Caldwell. And Tommy would have a home, a real home, with two people who'd fight heaven and earth to keep him safe. The next morning, Sunday, the entire town gathered for service in that same small church. The minister, an elderly man who'd watched Last Chance rise and nearly fall, spoke about justice and mercy, about strangers who became heroes, about faith rewarded in unexpected ways. When the service ended and people filed out into the cold, bright morning, Sarah and Martin stood together in the church doorway. The town clerk, a nervous man named Henderson, who'd secretly opposed Caldwell, but been too frightened to act, approached with a leather document folder. Henderson explained that all the foreclosure papers were void, the fraudulent loans canceled, but the properties needed to be legally returned to their rightful owners, which required new deeds signed and witnessed. He'd prepared fresh documents overnight, working by lamplight to undo months of Caldwell's corruption. One by one, families came forward to sign, reclaiming what had nearly been stolen, their relief and gratitude evident in every face. When the last deed was signed, Henderson produced one more document, this one different. The clerk said it was the deed to a small parcel on the eastern edge of town, 20 acres with a creek and good soil. Donated by the grateful townspeople as thanks for Sarah and Martin's courage. The land was theirs, free and clear, if they wanted it, a foundation to build whatever future they chose. Sarah looked at Martin, seeing her own wonder reflected in his gray eyes. He took the pen from Henderson and signed his name in careful script, then handed it to Sarah. She hesitated only a moment before signing beside him, their names side by side on the deed, as permanent as any marriage certificate. The crowd cheered, and someone started singing, and the winter morning filled with joy despite the cold. Martin pulled Sarah close, his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his strength, feeling truly safe for the first time since leaving Sweden. Tommy stood beside them, holding Sarah's free hand, his solemn face showing the first hint of a smile. They stood together in that church doorway, three people who'd found each other through danger and determination, bound by a promise none of them had expected, but all of them would keep. The locket hung around Sarah's neck, warm against her skin. Its impossible photograph now explained. Its purpose fulfilled. And as the townspeople celebrated around them, Sarah and Martin shared a look that needed no words. A recognition that whatever had brought them together, whether fate or coincidence or divine intervention, they would face everything that came next side by side, building a life and a family in this harsh autiful territory, protecting each other and the child they'd claimed as their own, until their last breath. The celebration continued around them as the winter sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snow-covered street. Martin turned to Sarah, his hand still holding hers, and spoke words he'd been carrying since that first desperate night in the storm.
I didn't know what I was looking for when I came to Last Chance. I thought it was just surveying work, just another job before moving on to the next town. But you changed everything. You and Tommy. You gave me something worth staying for, worth fighting for.
Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different from the tears she'd shed in fear and exhaustion over the past weeks. These were tears of joy, of relief, of a future unfolding before her that she'd never dared imagine when she'd stepped off that train with a frightened child and nothing but determination.
In Sweden, they told me America was the land of opportunity, but also danger. They said a woman alone would struggle, that I should find a husband quickly for protection. I refused to marry just for safety. I wanted to marry for love. Or not at all. And then I found you in the worst circumstances possible, and discovered that sometimes love and safety come together.
Tommy tugged on Sarah's dress, and she bent down to hear his whispered question. He wanted to know if this meant they were staying, if this was home now. Sarah looked at Martin, seeing the answer in his eyes before she spoke.
Yes, sweetheart. This is home. We're staying together, all three of us.
The boy's face transformed, the haunted look finally leaving his eyes, replaced by something Sarah had despaired of ever seeing again. Simple, childhood happiness. He threw his arms around her neck, then reached for Martin too, and they stood there in a three-way embrace, while the townspeople sang and laughed around them. Henderson cleared his throat politely, interrupting the moment with an apologetic expression. He explained that there was one more matter to address, something that required immediate attention. The railroad company, having heard about the surveyor who'd exposed fraud and saved an entire town from financial ruin, wanted to offer Martin a permanent position as chief surveyor for the Utah Territory, with a salary substantial enough to support a family. Martin looked stunned, clearly not having expected any reward beyond knowing he'd done the right thing. Sarah squeezed his hand, encouraging him to accept, knowing this was the security they needed to build the life they wanted. Martin accepted, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion, and Henderson shook his hand with genuine warmth. The crowd pressed close with congratulations, and Sarah found herself embraced by women who'd been strangers weeks ago, but now felt like sisters, united by shared survival and triumph over corruption. Old Mrs. Chen, the Chinese laundry owner who'd been one of Caldwell's earliest victims, pressed a small package into Sarah's hands, insisting it was a wedding gift, even though no formal engagement had been announced. Sarah opened it carefully, finding a beautiful handmade quilt stitched in a pattern of interlocking rings, symbolizing eternal connection. She thanked Mrs. Chen with genuine gratitude, touched by the gesture from someone who had so little to spare. Martin pulled Sarah aside, away from the crowd's immediate attention, to a quiet corner of the church steps. His expression was serious, and Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness, wondering if he was having second thoughts about the speed at which their lives were intertwining.
I know we've only known each other a short time. I know this isn't the courtship you deserve, the slow, proper getting acquainted that most couples have. But Sarah, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to build that house on our land. I want to raise Tommy with you. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're beside me. Will you marry me, properly and officially, as soon as we can arrange it?
Sarah's answer came without hesitation, her heart knowing what her mind had already accepted.
Yes. Yes, Martin. I'll marry you. Not because I need protection or security, though those matter, but because when I look at you, I see my future, and it's everything I hoped for but thought I'd never find.
They kissed then. A proper kiss. Not the desperate stolen moments of the past week, but a kiss that promised forever. And the crowd erupted in cheers, having noticed despite the couple's attempt at privacy. Reverend Miller, still standing near the church door, called out that he could perform the ceremony immediately if they wished, that he'd be honored to unite two people who'd shown such courage and character. Martin looked at Sarah questioningly, leaving the choice to her, and she laughed, feeling giddy with happiness.
Why wait? We've already faced the worst together. Let's start the best together right now.
And so, in a spontaneous ceremony witnessed by the entire grateful town, Sarah Sullivan and Martin Sullivan, who by pure coincidence shared a surname, though they'd met as strangers, became husband and wife under the clear, cold Utah sky, with Tommy standing proud between them as their son in spirit, if not in law. The vows were simple and traditional, but when Martin slid a plain gold band onto Sarah's finger, a ring donated by Henderson who'd kept it after his own wife passed, it felt like a sacred seal on a bond forged in fire and ice. They walked down the church steps as a family, into their new life, into the future they'd fought so hard to claim. And the winter sun seemed warmer, the air less bitter, the whole world more welcoming than it had been just hours before.